To order. Welcome to meeting number 114 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, April 18th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study on the state of airline competition in Canada. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all members and other meeting participants in the room of the following important preventative measures. To prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries, all in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from microphones at all times. As indicated in the communique from the Speaker of the House to all members on Monday, April 29th, the following measures have been taken to help prevent audio feedback incidents. All earpieces have been replaced by a model which greatly reduces the probability of audio feedback. The new earpieces are black in color, whereas the former earpieces were gray. Please only use a black-approved earpiece. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of the meeting. When you're not using your earpiece, please place it face down in the middle of the sticker for this purpose that you will find on the table as indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including, of course, our interpreters. Thank you all for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, and in accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'd like to inform the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Colleagues, appearing before us today for the first hour, we have from the Competition Bureau of Canada, Ms. Melissa Fisher, Deputy Commissioner, Mergers Directorate, and Bradley Callaghan, Associate Deputy Commissioner, Policy Planning and Advocacy Directorate. Welcome to you both. We'll begin with opening remarks, and for that, I will turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Melissa Fisher. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Competition Bureau's Mergers Directorate. Joining me today is my colleague Brad Callaghan, who is the Associate Deputy Commissioner of the Policy Planning and Advocacy Directorate. Le Bureau est un organisme indépendant.
Independent agency that protects and promotes competition for the benefit of Canadian consumers and businesses. We administer and enforce Canada's Competition Act, a law of general application that applies to every sector of the economy. We investigate and address abuses of market power, anti-competitive mergers, price fixing, and deceptive marketing practices. The Bureau also advocates for pro-competitive government rules and regulations. It's important to recognize that we are enforcers, not adjudicators. The Competition Act requires us to meet several thresholds and standards, such as proving that there has been a significant harm to competition.
Airline mergers, there is a public interest review process that can be triggered by the Minister of Transport. When that happens, our statutory role becomes one of advisor rather than enforcer. Our role is to identify any competition concerns relating to the merger to the Minister of Transport by way of a public report. And the Minister makes the final decision on whether to recommend approval of the proposed transaction. We've done this in 3 transactions in the recent years. Firstly, the First Air and Canadian North transaction in 2019, the proposed merger between Air Canada and Air Transat in 2020, and most recently the WestJet Sunwing merger. We believe that it's important to correct the record in light of prior testimony that you have heard. The Bureau did not approve these mergers. In fact, our public reports outlined the serious competition concerns that each of them raised. We also participated in the last major review of the Canada Transportation Act that was carried out in 2015. Our submission made a number of recommendations to government that we believe would result in lower prices, higher quality services, and greater innovation in the transportation industry. In light of recent events that have raised questions about the state of competition in the airline sector, the Bureau has been considering the value of a more fulsome study, separate from enforcement matters that review specific transactions or behavior. With that in mind, we have initiated the process to begin a market study of the industry. This will be our first market study under our new powers, which were granted in December of 2023 through Bill C-56. This follows our most recent study into the retail grocery sector. We intend to study the state of competition in the airline industry and how governments across Canada can improve competition for the benefit of domestic air passengers, as well as the workers and entrepreneurs who enable these services. We will be providing more details on this market study of the airline industry in the coming days when we launch a consultation on its terms of reference. Avant de répondre à vos questions, je tiens.
Before fielding your questions, I would note that the law requires the Bureau to conduct investigations in private and keep the information we have confidential. This obligation may prevent us from discussing some past or current investigations.
Opportunity to appear today, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fisher. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Competition Bureau for being here today in this very important study. We're here because this study was kicked off because we lost a Canadian competitor airline, Lynx Air, into Canada. And we've had some pretty in-depth study of what the state of the industry is, and I'm glad to hear that you are going to be conducting your own study into this industry. You did mention 3 airline mergers approved under this government, First Air Canada North, Air Canada, Air Transat, and WestJet and Sunwing. In every case, you found that there would be a substantial lessening of competition with that merger. In every case, the government approved the mergers over the objections of the Bureau. If our airline industry is always one merger away from a substantially uncompetitive environment, that should be setting off alarm bells to the Department of Transport. When we questioned the department on Tuesday, they seem to think everything is fine. What do we need to do to ensure we listen more to what the Competition Bureau is doing and to ensure we have more competition in the airline industry?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off on the mergers front. So merger reviews are specific to the transaction that's before us. They're not a broader investigation into the industry. They're particular to the overlap between the two parties that are proposing to merge. And as I mentioned in my opening, the way we proceed on a merger review where the Minister of Transport has commenced a public interest review it's different. Our role changes from one of enforcer to advisor. In that sense, our role is limited to providing the Minister of Transport with our views on the competition issues, regardless of the scope of the transaction. And this is, I guess this is a challenge that we have now, or at least a challenge for the Bureau. The way that public interest process works, regardless of whether the core competitive issues relate to transportation or not, we're making use of the same process. So recently we provided a report to the Minister with respect to Bunge's acquisition of Viterra. So these are 2 very large global vertically integrated agricultural businesses.
Oh, I'm so sorry, and I only have so much time.
Sorry.
Just going back to the issue of the mergers, Air Canada, Air Transat was approved, and then during COVID, it was decided this was not to be a good time to do that. We have a big competitor in Canada, Porter Air. They haven't come to this committee. We did have Flair Airlines come. Flair Airlines raised some pretty substantial issues and concerns relative to anti-competitive behavior that is ongoing. Has the Bureau had any of these concerns raised with it by the government or by Flair? And I know you can't comment on an ongoing investigation, but are there some investigations going in terms of anti-competitive behavior in the industry right now?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So obviously, as you said, we cannot comment on active investigations, but we certainly have investigated allegations. You mentioned Flair Airlines, and that is a matter. We're aware of the testimony from the other day. It is a matter that we looked at, allegations regarding predatory pricing. The Bureau did a significant review in this area, an in-depth review. The matter was discontinued in 2023, but I can assure you that it was looked at very seriously.
And are there ongoing investigations going on right now in terms of anti-competitiveness in the airline industry, whether it's Flair or anyone at all?
So that is not something we would be able to confirm to the committee, just owing to the confidential nature of our work. There are some instances where we would let the public know so that we can gather information that is important, but there's nothing that we can identify for the committee at this time.
From testimony the other day, I focused on gate allocations as being something that might be an anti-competitive, process or entity in terms of looking at how different airlines compete. We had some smaller airlines like Abbotsford talk about what they do. We looked at other big airports. Is the Bureau, when it completes its study, going to be also looking at real estate, so gate allocation, looking at how competitors compete on the ground as well as in the air?
So we will really look forward to providing a little bit more detail very shortly in terms of the scope of that study and the terms of reference. What we plan to do is when we get through our current phase, which involves a consultation with the Minister of ISED, is to publish our terms of reference, which should explain in a little bit more detail what we would plan to study. For now, what I would say is we're looking at the state of competition in these markets in Canada, and it'll be obvious from, I think, some of the past work that we have studied that barriers to entry, for example, are an important part of competition.
And part of the powers that were given from C-56 were also to have the minister, I guess from ISED, because you are still a part of ISED, direct studies. Has the minister at all asked for reviews or studies on the state of airline competition in Canada?
10-second response, please.
Yes or no?
So this study has been proposed by the Competition Bureau. I want to be mindful of that process and the consultation that is currently underway with our minister. This one was proposed by the Competition Bureau. Yeah.
Next, we will go to Mr. Iachino. Mr. Iachino, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank the witnesses for being here. Ms. Fisher, could you explain to the committee what factors you take into account when a business shows up and wants to get into the aviation sector?
What kind of barriers to entry when new companies are coming into the sector?
Thank you for the question. If you don't mind, I'll respond in English. It's a bit technical. In each of those 3 merger reviews that I mentioned in the opening, we looked at barriers to entry. It's an important part of the analysis that we do. But on the enforcement front, we're looking specifically at barriers that relate to the actual overlaps between the networks of the merging parties. So it's a very specific investigation.
Maybe just to,
We have noticed that the industry is subject to rules specifically on drip pricing. Does the Competition Bureau have any additional regulations for airlines? And can you explain what they are?
Our rules regarding drip pricing are not specific to airlines. This is consistent with the Competition Act in general, although there is a bit of a different approach to mergers for the transport sector. Our rules for drip pricing are of general application. They apply to essentially all companies in the economy. And these rules really kind of go to the heart of making sure that consumers understand the products that are being offered to them, and they're not misled. So drip pricing is really about making sure that companies are being told the full amount of the price that they're going to pay for their product, not shown an initial price and then have additional fees added on in the rest of the purchasing process, to the point that the final price is something that would have been unattainable compared to what was first advertised.
Thank you. At what point do you step in to determine whether there is adequate competition in the air sector, and what does that process look like?
Yeah, so there's two, I guess there's sort of two streams to answering that question. To the extent that there's either a merger or conduct that is potentially contrary to the Competition Act, we can commence an investigation. So that's how we would look at it from the enforcement side.
The other part of our mandate is really about promoting competition, and that is where our market study powers fall. So the purpose of doing market studies is really to get a better sense about how competition is working from a holistic perspective, as compared to looking at specific conduct that might be alleged or a specific merger that might be proposed. And the outcome of our market studies tends to be more aimed at governments, so often include recommendations about how we can try to improve competition in Canada.
I'd like to ask you, have you ever received any requests from any American airline company? Because we've heard the other day from WestJet that American Airlines are not interested to come and set up shop in Canada because of XYZ. So have you ever received any request on behalf of any American company to come and want to set up shop in Canada?
So in the course of an investigation, in a merger investigation, one of the things that we look for are potential entrants. So in doing our reviews, we will talk to anyone who we who might be identified as a potential entrant.
Okay, so you can't let us know if you've ever received any request or interest from any American airline company.
Yeah, unfortunately, no, we cannot.
Okay. Quel est l'impact de la
What's the impact of the 49% limit in foreign ownership? What's the impact on competition and air transportation services in Canada, especially with the closure of Lynx Airline?
Alors peut-être je peux commencer.
Maybe I could start. It's not an aspect of competition that we really looked at closely recently. Maybe the most recent aspect of our analysis on the issue is in the 2015 report that my colleague, Ms. Fisher, mentioned. It was our submission in the review process in the Canadian Transportation Act.
Foreign ownership restrictions as an aspect of a barrier to entry in the market. So that is one of our fundamental recommendations that came out of our submission in that work, that it is a barrier to entry and ultimately is something that we recommended liberalizing and negotiating with our trading partners to try to encourage more competition.
Et face aux défis économiques.
And faced with some of the current economic challenges, what strategies of the main airline industries in Canada or companies, what are they doing to remain competitive and viable?
Peut-être c'est une...
Maybe this aspect, we will try to assess it during our market study.
Generally, day to day, is something that we would be studying mostly in our enforcement mandate when we would review the specific facts of a case. So our reviews of mergers, for example, are obviously based on evidence and facts, but they're looking at very specific conduct that is happening in the marketplace. So I don't think we're in a position to make a general statement today in terms of a trend in the industry, but certainly something that we'll be thinking if our proposed market study moves forward.
Thank you, Mr. Callaghan.
Merci.
Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcel.
Next, we have Mr. Barcel Duval. You have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank people from the Competition Bureau who are here today. I see that you're already working on a study on the state of competitiveness in the airline industry. So maybe if we had called you a few days later, a little later, we might have had more information. I don't know if we'll have an opportunity to see you soon, but what I wanted to come back to that was raised by one of our colleagues earlier. There have been several proposals, sales and major proposals of airline companies in the past few years. I can think about the sale of Sunwing to WestJet. Air Transat was sold to Air Canada, and I think there was another case going further back. But these two cases, in the two situations, there were serious concerns raised by the Competition Bureau, especially in the case of Air Canada Transat, and the European Competition Bureau said it wasn't a good idea, but the government still approved it. There are mechanisms that we could implement to make sure that when the government makes a decision that goes against competition, maybe we have to better control this process. Can measures be implemented to make sure that there is more transparency in how government makes decisions? The way you do your study, there is a clear, explicit document, but for the government, it's a lot more complex, trying to understand what these decisions are really based on.
So I think what you're describing is the current process where the commissioner is providing his report to the Minister of Transport, who is also getting a report with respect to public interest issues as they relate to national transportation. The commissioner's role is limited in these kinds of circumstances to providing that report on the competition concerns, and then to the extent that there are concerns and the parties propose measures to address those concerns. Again, the commissioner is required to provide the minister with his advice as to the effectiveness of those proposed measures. So in each of the mergers that you referred to, we did provide the minister with our views of those measures, but that's the extent of our involvement in the process.
OK, merci pour la réponse. Peut-être
Thank you for your answer. Maybe another question for you relates to, more specifically, the access gates at the airports. This issue was raised several times in our study. It seemed to be an issue in some airports where there is limited space. I was just wondering if you could have a possible role for the Competition Bureau to intervene in the problem areas. For example, all the gates are busy, all the schedules are busy, and if there is a new company that wants to have a certain time frame or have an access gate in the airport, there could be a legislative framework that gives the Competition Bureau the power to free up certain access gates and certain schedules. Could that promote competitiveness?
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
The first thing to say is that the access at airports and gates would be a part of our process to understand how competition is being affected in our cases already. So in the cases that Ms. Fisher is describing, understanding what kinds of barriers to entry would be a part of our assessment of the process, and it would feed into recommendations that would be made to the Minister of Transport. There is a broader set of conduct that the Competition Bureau is responsible for beyond mergers. So for example, if there were allegations about conduct that might be between, for example, airlines and an airport that may be anti-competitive. In other words, a strategic behavior to try to exclude competitors in that space or try to prevent competition. We would obviously look at that kind of those kinds of allegations and determine whether it might raise issues under other parts of our act, such as abuse of dominance, for example.
un autre point que je voudrais soulever.
Another point I'd like to raise with you is the issue of the powers you have to carry out investigations when there are allegations, or if you suspect that there could be abuses relating to dominant position. In my work as spokesperson for transportation issues I've often discussed with people in the regions, regional airports, small carriers, and it's near unanimity. It comes up, they face situations in which when they're trying to set up a new link or liaison for a given destination, often there was a major player that came in and the prices went up. And when they filed a complaint to the Competition Bureau, they had the impression that nothing happened because it takes years and years before a report is drafted. There's so much documentation to be filed. It is discouraging. They often don't have the financial means to face unfair competition for months and years. Are there any possible solutions to resolve these issues with more efficiency? Unfortunately, Mr. Basalu, no more time left, but maybe you'll have an opportunity in your next questioning period.
It was a very thorough question.
He'll
so-
give it back to me later, so it's all good.
Okay, Mr. Callaghan, please answer the question. If you can try and do it in 20 to 30 seconds, please, sir.
Perhaps what I can say is that one encouraging thing is modernization of the current Competition Act. This is something the Competition Bureau has been quite public about in terms of asking for change. And there has been very meaningful change over the last 2 to 3 years, a series of modernizations, including our abuse of dominance framework. So we're certainly encouraged that with some of these modernizations and those that are still proposed and before Parliament, that the Competition Bureau will be able to move as quickly as possible. We always aim to do that. I'm not sure of the exact case that you may be referring to, but obviously we always take a good hard look at our own work as well and try to move as quickly as we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Callaghan. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours, sir. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being here and contributing to this study. I think earlier in your testimony you mentioned a previous, maybe I misheard, but a previous market study that you'd done on the air sector. Is this upcoming study, the comprehensive one, the first market-wide study you've done, or is there a previous one?
Thank you for the question. So just to clarify, I think the earlier study that I mentioned was more of a submission that we did to the legislative review of the Canada Transportation Act. So what we are envisioning anyways in terms of a new market study would aim to be a little bit more in-depth and also specific to the airline sector. The Canada Transportation Act review covered rail, airlines, and marine as well, so a little bit broader, but different from a market study.
So specific to the legislative review and your recommendations around the air sector, how many of those recommendations were implemented by the government?
I believe one of the recommendations was about foreign ownership restrictions and implementing. I believe it was kind of putting into force or coming into force a proposal that was already in I don't know if it was regulation or legislation, but going up to 49% of foreign ownership restrictions. So my understanding is that has since been done, yeah, we're obviously. We keep in mind other recommendations that we make, but I should say we are mindful of the broader public interest considerations that the minister has. Our focus really is central to competition. We have a singular lens, so that is liberating in the sense that we are strong advocates for it, and we think there should be more priority kind of put on this factor, but certainly the Minister of Transport has a broader set of factors that they're considering.
And we heard in previous testimony about different empirical approaches for measuring competitiveness in different sectors. Is there a methodology that the Competition Commissioner uses when assessing competition in the air sector or any other sector? And a follow-up to that is, are there benchmarks or targets? Like we talk about competition, more competition is better because it creates more affordable goods and services for consumers, but we never really talk about where we're trying to get to. Is there any sort of a defined sense of what we're trying to achieve?
start on the merger side.
Yeah, maybe I'll start on the merger side, on the enforcement side. So there we're looking at the potential anti-competitive effects of a particular transaction. So generally, you're looking at whether there'll be an increase in market share that exceeds 30 or 35%. That's sort of what's set out in our guidelines. But that's specific to each market. So we'd be looking at that with respect to each OD pair. And looking at the market share and the concentration on each route, not like a broader industry view of what competition should look like.
I'm particularly interested in smaller regional markets representing a rural part of Canada, and we see a real lack of competition and we see high prices as a result. Will your upcoming market study include a focus on regional routes and regional markets and the impact on rural Canada?
It's certainly something that we are mindful of, and we've taken note of the particular features of especially Northern Canada markets, because it's been a part of our past reviews. Particular features there including things like whether particular equipment that may be needed to serve those areas, and also just the importance of transportation for people to connect with broader setters and essential facilities. Certainly mindful of it. If I can just make a plug for one other thing in terms of how we assess competition, it's a more holistic study that we did on the intensity of competition in Canada over the last 20 years. We looked at, these were not competition markets, but more industries using NAICS codes. But we looked at aspects like what the amount of concentration in some of these sectors, as well as what we called rank stability, who's in first place in the market, and are those ranks moving around,
right,
and entry and exit, to just try to get a better sense of how competition might be working.
Maybe if I can fit in one more question. Thinking about rural Canada and rural markets, and we see this in telecommunications as well, like the government's focus in terms of delivering affordability is always competition. But in really small markets, is it reasonable to expect multiple carriers to provide that competition? And what we see in rural areas is that usually there's just one provider of a service, and that monopoly creates really unaffordable situations. So are there limits to what the focus on competition can deliver for consumers in certain markets?
I think just as a starting point, it's certainly where we hope the market can deliver its benefits. We trust that the market is going to bring all of those things that the member mentioned: low prices, service. But we recognize that there are times where markets can fail, and we're not an organization that is against regulation. What we try to advocate for is to make sure that where regulation might be necessary, that we keep as much room as possible for competition to work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach, and thank you, Mr. Callaghan. Next, we have Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To either Ms. Fisher or Mr. Callahan, has a merger ever been blocked in Canada? Yes or no?
No.
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 So in all the years, we've never had a merger blocked. I know we look at not just airlines, we look across all industries, so telecommunications, we'll look at banking. We had Ms. Jeanne Pratt at the industry committee not too long ago, who did state that because of the merger of Rogers and Shaw, that they saw no evidence that prices were going down. We have had WestJet Sunwing merge. Do we have any evidence so far that the prices are going down, or we're seeing any benefit to that merger?
It wouldn't be in our normal course to track the outcomes of something like that. It could be done sometimes we do what we call ex post studies of remedies, looking at whether the measures that were taken to ensure that the market remained competitive were effective or not.
The Bureau does not track after effects. Is that something you'll be studying and probably be looking at in the upcoming study?
So, unfortunately, we just for where we are at in the process at the moment, until we complete this phase of consulting with the minister, I can't comment on whether that's something we would specifically be looking at.
I guess what I'll look for then is generality. We have had recent mergers, HSBC, RBC, Rogers Shaw. How do mergers in general, when you've done your studies, impact consumer prices and service?
So we have a very well-established process that we use when we identify competition concerns to ensure that we resolve those concerns. Typically, we're able to negotiate a resolution with the parties that we feel address the concerns through structural means, so by divesting assets or parts of a business, and that becomes an agreement that's registered with the tribunal and are quite effective.
And I think you recommended a divestiture, or you would have, with Rogers Shaw. It ended up going to the tribunal. We know the tribunal, for instance, when you made a recommendation for Rogers Shaw, it went to the tribunal. The tribunal then overturned your decision. Can you comment on the effectiveness of the tribunal? Are there other nations across Canada across the world that don't have a tribunal that give more power to the Competition Bureau?
Just to clarify, the commissioner's role in that instance is to bring an application to the tribunal. He is not an adjudicator. So we filed an application seeking to block that transaction, but at the end of the day, it's the Competition Tribunal's decision. Globally, there's different models in terms of how competition agencies are run. There are some competition agencies who are both the investigator and the decision maker.
There's been some amendments to the new Competition Act amendments. The Conservative Party does support the NDP amendments that give a bit more power in terms of looking at merger remedies, bringing that 35% down to 30%, for instance. Are these going to be amendments that are really going to help the Competition Bureau look at mergers with a better lens to be able to block a merger for once in Canada?
Those are significant amendments that have been proposed, but with respect to competition in the airline sector, there really won't be much of an effect because of the process that is currently in place under the Canada Transportation Act, where we're feeding into the minister's decision.
That's right, and it is unfortunate the minister did not feel this was an important enough topic to be in front of committee, and we're really disappointed with that. I know a lot of members have commented on that. In terms of going back to the industry as a whole in Canada, my colleague did mention rural Canada. We did talk about, there's some topics where we look at open skies or look at other ways, the 49% threshold, maybe one shot, where a foreign investment could then be put up to 49%, not the 25% threshold. Are there other initiatives you've seen across the globe that we should be studying, or something that you feel will add to competitiveness in the airline industry in Canada?
I know that there has been work done by similar agencies to ours in other countries. Australia and the UK come to mind. I know Australia is often thought of as something worthwhile to compare because of distances between major centres and our landmass. There may be particular features in those examples where the agency might have more of a hands-on regulatory function. For example, they might be monitoring prices on a little bit more of a day-to-day basis. But I believe in both cases of Australia and the UK, they responded to consultations by their transport departments in terms of how they can improve competition. One aspect that I think was central to it was about access to slots at the airports and recommendations on how they can improve those for competition.
Thank you, Mr. Callaghan. I appreciate that. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our guest today. Of course, we all pay close attention to problems in the air industry, particularly in rural Canada. When you fly in and out of Atlantic Canada, as I do, and as Mr. Bachrach flies into rural areas and is riding as well, you realize that there's a lot of problems that we need addressed, and whether it's accessibility or the cost of airline tickets and so on, it's really challenging. And in Atlantic Canada, for example, if you're flying into St. John's, it's much, much better in terms of accessibility. But if you're flying into Gander or Dare Lake or some of the smaller airports, it's really difficult getting a flight, first of all. And secondly, the cost is extremely high compared to some other flights that you would do. So when you look at these airlines, and I think about, you mentioned earlier about the merger, I think, wasn't there an issue with Air Canada and Air Transat where there was a proposed merger that got blocked?
Yes, so there was. They proposed to merge. The Minister of Transport commenced a public interest review. The Commissioner provided a report that identified significant competition concerns on 83 routes, either to sun destinations or to Europe. Subsequent to that, the parties proposed certain measures to address those competition concerns. In response, the Commissioner provided a letter to the Minister, which is public, indicating that the proposed measures were insufficient in his view to address the competition concerns. Ultimately, the European Competition Agency also had to look at that transaction because of the transatlantic flights. And my understanding is Air Canada was not prepared to accept the remedies that were being required by the European Commission, and that was one of the reasons they stated for abandoning the transaction.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. But what I want to ask is this. We've heard from the airline industry that, they're subject to a specific set of rules. So would you be able to share with this committee what these rules are and how they apply to smaller, medium, and larger airlines? Or is it just a one-size-fits-all approach?
Yeah, I mean, I can start on the enforcement side, and those rules are not something that we would look into unless they constituted a barrier to entry. And there aren't any sort of specific rules that are identified in our reports that would be different among carriers of different sizes.
And just speaking from the perspective of promoting competition, we would tend to look at, approach those kinds of issues in terms of whether they are having any kind of effect on competition. Kind of goes to the point earlier about recognizing that there is regulation needed in some circumstances. How can we encourage as much competition as possible within it? And so we have a toolkit that we always recommend to regulators to kind of consider whether regulations and rules are having an undue impact on competition. Is it favoring one supplier over others? Is it creating barriers to entry? And is it giving customers as much ability as possible to kind of compare prices and what's being offered to them?
Yeah, and when I think about, the airlines that have failed, low-cost airlines that have upstarts that have lasted for weeks or months, for short periods, when they fail, in the case of some recent airlines, do they report to you as to why that happened, or do you reach out to them and ask, what were the issues that prevented them from being successful in the airline industry in Canada?
So it's not something we would do in the normal course of an investigation to reach out to them and ask them why they're failed, but it's certainly something that could be part of a market study, that kind of interaction with them.
I just wonder if the rules around the Competition Bureau and other rules that they have to follow, whether that has a significant impact on their success or failure.
I don't think so. I mean, the enforcement part of the Act is geared towards anti-competitive behavior or anti-competitive mergers. So unless they fit into one of those buckets, we wouldn't be interfering or investigating into what they're doing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers, and thank you, Ms. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
We have Mr. Basili Duval for 2.5 minutes. Please, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on the last question I asked earlier, A few years ago, I remember looking at the rules and amendments and the Competition Act, and I realized that the Competition Bureau had already had the powers to come up with preventive ordinances. The Competition Bureau doesn't need to finish its investigation, then go before the Competition Tribunal. They could sort of forestall some of the major damages that could occur in the future. Was this part of the list of modernization items that you would have recommended in terms of amendments in the Competition Act?
We did not recommend an independent power to become an adjudicator. So we are still fundamentally an enforcer of the law. We take the law as it's given to us, and ICED is the policy lead in terms of what the Competition Act looks like, and we go to the Competition Tribunal as an adjudicator or other courts if appropriate. So our institutional framework has not changed in terms of being the enforcer of the Competition Act, but getting resolutions to cases can happen if they are consensual. In other words, if we raise concerns to the parties about violations of the Competition Act or concerns that we have with the transaction, obviously we can come to a resolution, and we try to register those resolutions with the Competition Tribunal so that it has the force of law.
Merci. Peut-être.
Thank you. And maybe another point that I would like to hear from you about. You spoke earlier about, you said you had already submitted some possible modernizing impacts on the Competition Act, allowing more interventions either before the tribunal or the competition office. Could you provide us such a list and indicating those elements that would be applicable to air transport? That could be quite useful for us in our study. And for the rest of my time, I'll be generous with my colleague as he was with me. Thank you, Mr. Bachelet Duval. Mr. Bachelet.
Sir, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to my colleague. I hope this is this anti-competitive behavior? I'm not sure. We'll get the commission to look into it. I wanted to ask about the abuse of dominance framework. I was also reflecting on the comments we heard from Flair about the actions of the bigger airlines. And, you know, as I mentioned before, in smaller markets, I think we see some similar behavior. At least we see, price wars in communities that have competition, and in other communities, we don't see that kind of behavior. Could you talk a little bit about the abuse of dominance framework and how, I guess, how it's defined and how it can be used to avoid that kind of behavior?
Sure, I can try to take a crack at it. So essentially what we are trying to protect against is dominant firms being able to exercise more market power because of specific conduct. This has undergone a recent change from the recent modernization of the Competition Act. In a nutshell, the old framework was a requirement to prove three things. Market power, in other words, that the firm was big. Second, conduct, a practice of anti-competitive act. And third was the effect on competition. After the changes to the Competition Act, we can now seek a prohibition order, stop the conduct. If we have the first aspect, so the firm is dominant, and then we have one of two things, either a practice that was intended to harm a competition or a competitor, or an effect. We'd be able to have a broader set of remedies if we could prove all three, but that is now a change that I think opens things up a little bit for a prohibition order. If I can just say predatory pricing, it is a bit particular because we're looking at low prices, and we're mindful to approach these cases carefully, just to make sure that we are not taking away from customers competition on the merits and the benefit of low prices. But the theory in this case of predatory pricing is a concern that it's a short-term low pricing below the costs of the dominant firm, with a long-term effect of raising prices above the competitive level once they've been able to exclude or discipline their competitor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Callaghan, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow on a little bit with Mr. Bacharach's line of questioning, has the Competition Bureau ever been asked to or ever considered investigating the choices of airlines to remove themselves from a market, which, I guess it's about scheduling and route selection. There's concerns that when a dominant player leaves a market, that the price, obviously competition is reduced. Do you have the power? Obviously, you have the power to investigate mergers and make recommendations. But for companies that are already operating in the federally regulated space, do you actually have the ability to investigate their ongoing business decisions to determine whether or not they are anti-competitive? If leaving a market or choosing to focus on a specific region when they have been players in another market, thereby reducing competition. Is that something that is within your purview to investigate?
Certainly, we can investigate alleged conduct that may touch on those issues. So this can happen in a variety of ways. It can come from complaints from the marketplace, but the Competition Bureau can also start investigations on its own if we're aware of things that we may see in the news or the industry press. So certainly there is an ability to investigate those things. The outcome always depends on the evidence. So we would be doing an in-depth review to try to understand what is the conduct, what happened, what was the intention of the players in play, and what the effects might be in the marketplace.
Are there, without again getting into the details, are there any active investigations of that nature currently before the Competition Bureau?
Mr. Chair, we cannot comment on that, just owing to the confidential nature of our work. It's a specific confidentiality provision that's written into our legislation that we apply.
Okay. When you're evaluating competition, the availability, what the impact of the actions of a company, either just in their operations or in terms of proposed mergers, are you constrained to considering only the Canadian market? We've heard much testimony about Canadians using U.S. airports and U.S. airlines to fly similar routes because of the cost. Are you able to examine, competition, for instance, in the Fraser Valley or the Lower Mainland would include driving across the border and flying from Bellingham or Seattle Tacoma Airport? Do you ever consider that when doing your analysis about whether a merger or the actions of a company would impact competition?
Yeah, that was a relevant consideration in our two most recent reviews. And so just to remind you again, in a merger review, we're looking at competition on specific OD pairs. And in the Air Canada and the WestJet review, those were, it was competition for vacation packages, not just the flight. But in the context of those reviews, we looked at OD pairs and whether border airports might be substitutes for passengers. And the evidence that we collected indicated that there'd have to be a large price differential before a passenger would incur the time and the added transportation costs to substitute away to a border airport.
Right. We heard evidence that up to 7 million Canadians use that proximity to the border to travel out of U.S. airports on U.S. carriers. My final question will be, in terms of mergers, there's often a remedy proposed by the companies when they are proposing the merger to offset concerns about a lack of competition. What enforcement mechanisms do you actually have, or do those go into the political realm? If a merger is approved by the minister, and then subsequently the companies who have merged, or the new entity, goes back on what they promised that they would do to maintain competition?
There is a process, and I'll have to say, I'm not completely familiar with it, but there is a process in the CTA to seek redress when there's concern that the terms or conditions have been breached. I believe it involves going to court.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fisher, and thank you, Mr. Strahl. Next, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll start off with the first question. What are the Bureau's thoughts on the claims that the regulations such as APPR and the additional fees have an impact on competition or within competition?
So there's no specific perspective that we take in terms of fees. Our view is really about how regulation may impact competition. So I think there is some commentary on fees that go to those regulations that were commented on in our 2015 submission on the Canada Transportation Act. I mean, generally speaking, obviously, as I said earlier, our general perspective is that regulation is used only when necessary to address market failures. But certainly we recognize that there are times when it is necessary. And our goal really as advocates for competition is to try to make sure that competition can work to the fullest extent possible while regulators can achieve their objectives. So typically we're not experts in terms of the other public policy interests that a regulator might be trying to address, whether it's safety or anything else. But what we do try to do is work with regulators to try to understand that competing public policy objective and make recommendations on how competition can kind of work to the fullest extent possible at the same time.
Thank you. Now, we are going to be embarking on a study focusing on northern communities as well as those that are more remote. And of course, with that, the level of service is a lot less than those that are more populated. So given Canada's unique geography and low population density, travel demand at regional airports is scarce. Does the Bureau have any thoughts on how to viably stimulate more competition in Canada and ensure connectivity for regional and more remote communities?
So that is not something that we have studied kind of as an issue in and of itself. We have, as I said earlier, we have looked at some of the particular features of air travel in those communities as it relates to competition in specific cases, and there have been with regard to travel to Canada's north, and they do have particular challenges and barriers. So we're live to them from past work, but we have not studied kind of as an independent issue what could be done to improve competition in those areas.
Okay. And the Bureau has previously advocated for loosening current rules around foreign ownership of airlines to allow for 100% ownership to compete against Canadian carriers. Are there any international examples of this succeeding that you can point to? And does the Bureau see this increased domestic competition as sustainable in the long term? I guess another part of that is, has the Bureau considered any potential economic implications should a national carrier fail as a result?
I don't think that is something that, on the last part of the member's question, I don't think that is something we have studied in detail. I believe in our submission to the CTA review in 2015 does look at a few comparators internationally. This can be checked, but New Zealand comes to mind as one where I believe there was a more openness to foreign ownership. That our perspective is obviously that competition is central to driving lower prices, more choice, and productivity in our economy. It comes from the perspective of really having competition as the central part of our mandate. Obviously, as I said earlier, this is weighed against other factors, public policy factors, by ministers such as the Minister of Transport. But certainly we think it's something that's very important, and we know we're not alone. This is something that has been mentioned as early as for example, the 2008 Compete to Win report by Red Wilson and that panel, that Canada has not placed sufficient importance on competition in terms of competing public policy objectives, and it's why we're a strong advocate to try to improve its importance.
So to get, I guess, a bit more granular based on those comments, does the Bureau have any recommendations with respect to reciprocal cabotage? This to stimulate competition, obviously, but is the Bureau aware of any foreign airlines that wish to operate in Canada? Would it foresee foreign airlines operating between regional Canadian destinations? And what would be the impact on Canadian carriers and employment of Canadians if that was to occur? And what impact could there be on regional connectivity?
Maybe I'll start just in terms of our specific investigations. Unfortunately, to the extent that a U.S. carrier expressed their interest or their desire to us to enter, it's not something that we can share due to our confidentiality obligations.
Just a quick 10-second follow-up,
Yes.
Mr. Gallen.
It's just to say, and there's more reading that can be done in our submission to the CTA, but we did support cabotage, more openness to a foreign carrier being able to fly on Canada-to-Canada routes. I want to make sure I'm just kind of, I'm not an airline expert, so I just want to make sure we're on the same page. But yes, we did explain in that report that we were supportive of that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. That concludes the first half of our meeting today. We will suspend for 5 minutes in order to allow the audiovisual team to set up for our subsequent witnesses. I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing today. This meeting is suspended. I call this meeting back to order. Colleagues, appearing before us for the second half of today's meeting, we have Dr. Barry Prentice, Professor, Transport Institute, University of Manitoba, by video conference. Welcome to you. And from the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, we have Mr. John Lawford, Executive Director and General Counsel, as well as Mika Coleman, I hope I pronounced that correctly, articling student. Welcome to you both. We'll begin with opening remarks, and for that, I'll turn it over to our two witnesses who are appearing in person. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Honourable members, my name is John Lawford. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, and with me today is PIAC's articling student, Mika Coleman. I will start by quoting a PIAC report on airline competition in Canada. Today, in Canada, it is difficult to choose what is likely to be less inefficient, a regulated duopoly or an unregulated one. Just so you know, those words were written in 1989. Plus ça change. There was, and is currently, a problem with concentration in the Canadian market. But this market is now also segmented into regional route markets. WestJet claims to have returned to its roots as a low-cost carrier and has retreated to a hub in Western Canada, while allowing Air Canada mostly free rein in Eastern Canada. While this appears to leave room for regionally based competition, or even national or regional ultra-low-cost carrier or ULCC entry in either WestJet or an Air Canada zone of influence, we see the ULCCs are failing. The pandemic has upset all of the airlines' apple carts, and only now the staffing, routes, passenger demand, and financing are starting to return to 2019 levels. However, it is the structural and regulatory elements of the Canadian market that determined the effects of events such as the pandemic and before, such as the 737 MAX groundings in 2019. The market structure remains one dominated by Air Canada as a national airline, with WestJet once again a large regional, although with Sunwing vacation routes now, a Central Canada regional, Porter, with national aspirations, and one international vacation carrier, which is Air Transat, that is only here because the EU and not the minister said it should not be sold to Air Canada. ULCCs are entering and exiting within 2 to 3 years despite planned nationwide operations. The latest three are failing or are refinancing or have failed. Why? Barriers to entry are too high in Canada. No support is given to entrants, and the predictable defensive strategies available to major airlines such as route matching and predatory pricing were not something that competition law, till now, could police effectively. All mergers have been approved by the Minister of Transport, leading to concentration. At a higher level, there is no home for airline competition regulation and no stated government air policy in general, and no statement of how such policy goals, such as small market service and cost, consumer choice and pricing reductions, service quality and safety, etc., could be met by competition. However, new tools are available to the sector and include the improvements to the Competition Act and studies, such as that announced today, as well as studies from other countries on competition, and in particular, Australia. Mika?
In this policy vacuum, therefore, we propose 6 radical changes. 3 to help nascent competition and competitors, and 3 to frame the conversation about regulation and competition and provide some dim hope for a future competitive market. First, the Government of Canada should support competitive entry with a lending bank of 10 government-owned aircraft of various sizes, but leased at cost, available only to competitors and upon conditions such as serving certain routes at certain frequencies and with exit barriers. Second, airports should reserve time and gate slots for new entrants. Third, there should be enforcement of abusive dominance rules on route matching and price cutting, and setting price floors for incumbents, entry conditions, and exit conditions. Fourth, approval of airline merger reviews should be flipped. The Transport Minister can advise, but the Competition Bureau or Tribunal should decide. Fifth, Transport Canada should develop specific air competition policy, not the present vague air marketplace framework, in consultation with the Competition Bureau. And finally, The Competition Bureau should do a market study on airline travel within Canada, which we are pleased they just announced before us today.
Considering such radical thinking will hopefully help fix the sector and help us to avoid seeing you again in 35 years to say the same things once again. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you both for those opening remarks. We'll now turn the floor over to Dr. Prentice for his opening remarks. Dr. Prentice, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. The Structure Conduct Performance Framework is a useful paradigm for considering the state of competition in the airline industry. Structure refers to the number of players, the similarity of product, and the cost of entry and exit. Domestic competition in Canada is limited to 4 scheduled passenger airlines, excluding the Arctic and remote communities. Air Canada and WestJet, which offer full-service airlines, account for over 80% of the market. They operate airport hubs to serve domestic, transport, or international freight or passenger services, as well as cargo services. The 2 smaller airlines, Flair and Porter, operate point-to-point services with niche strategies. Flair positions itself as a discount carrier, while Porter offers non-price benefits and caters more to a business market. For many consumers, air travel has become a commodity. All companies use the same planes, with minimal differences in non-price attributes of service. The geography of the market also matters. The narrow, linear shape of the Canadian market means that all competitors fly the same parallel routes across the country, leaving scant room for differentiation. Entry and exit costs depend on the industry's ratio of fixed to variable costs. A high proportion of fixed costs favors industry concentration. However, some costs can be made semi-variable, such as leasing aircraft, and by subcontracting labor like baggage handling. The largest variable cost is fuel. Entry costs involve setting up a reservation system, labor contracts, renting airport space, and maintenance operations. Industry exit is easier, but these are sunk costs. Large airlines experience economies of scale and size. The more origin-destination pairs in a network, the bigger their customer base. Size also enables airlines to form hub and spoke networks. Larger aircraft, which are more profitable, can be deployed from hub locations where they benefit from the S-curve. The S-curve observation is that airlines increase flights. As they increase flights at an airport, they receive a disproportionate share of passengers. Economies of size also apply to the costs of operations such as hangars, maintenance, and overhead expenses. The conduct of firms is generally opaque because regulations exist to curb anti-competitive behavior, such as price fixing, misrepresentation, and abuse of a dominant position. In an oligopolistic market, however, tacit collusion is possible. The major players can react to each other's moves with an eye to sharing the market and maximizing their profits. Until the 1980s, air conduct was subject to strict price and route competition or regulation with the goals of stability and consumer protection. Deregulation of the airlines was based on the theory of contestable markets. Essentially, this theory holds that the participants in a market with few rivals could conduct themselves in a competitive manner if the threat of new entrants was sufficient to cause them to focus on sales rather than profits. The history of the Canadian airlines since deregulation has supported the reliance on contestable market theory. The number of new entrants entering and exiting has kept the market competitive. For example, the big airlines set up discount subsidiaries to meet the challenge posed by new entrants by matching their fares and routes. The performance of the airlines is measured by their profitability and efficiency. Profitability is easier to assess for publicly traded companies than efficiency. In general, investors have viewed the profitability of scheduled air carriers as less attractive than most publicly traded companies. Nonetheless, the major airlines have been relatively stable, with mergers rather than bankruptcies being the predominant outcome. Whether air service in Canada is as efficient as it could be is clouded by protectionism. Domestic competition is constrained by cabotage restrictions that prohibit foreign airlines from operating within the Canadian market. Also, foreign ownership controls restrict access to international investment capital that could lead to more efficient scale and fleet renewal. Although ticket prices are rising, so are costs for labor, equipment, and fuel that could impact competition. All airlines have experienced higher wage settlement demands as workers try to catch up with inflation. The worldwide demand for air pilots has caused wage increases well above the rate of inflation. The threatened strike by WestJet's aircraft maintenance fraternal organization is the latest example of this. Rising interest rates add to the cost base of this capital-intensive industry. The low exchange rate value of the Canadian dollar also matters because most aircraft and parts are imported. Oil prices are currently low, but fuel prices will rise with carbon taxes and the adoption of sustainable aviation fuels. Finally, the losses incurred during the pandemic are unlikely to be extinguished already. The impact of ticket prices on demand for air travel in Canada is also affected by fees and charges that are outside the domain of the airlines. The Canadian airports have raised fees to deal with debts that were incurred during the pandemic. The Government of Canada continues to extract rent payments from the airports and user fees for security that ultimately are all paid by the consumer. The weak economy and the possibility that it may dip into a recession does not bode well for passenger demand. Air travel is a more luxury than necessity for most leisure passengers. Business travel has also been cut by the pandemic experience and a shift to virtual meetings, although some revival may be occurring. Since deregulation, airline competition in Canada has resulted in 2 large scheduled carriers and the entry-exit of a series of smaller carriers. The recent loss of a very small airline, Lynx, does not mean that the further contraction is inevitable.
Dr. Prentice, my apologies to cut you off. I am going to have to ask you to wrap up your opening remarks if you could, please, sir.
Will do.
Thank you, sir.
Applying the structure conduct performance lens to the airline competition in Canada suggests that the status quo is providing reasonable outcomes for most consumers, notwithstanding service cuts in some smaller centres. The ability of new entrants to challenge the dominant players is the basis for the relaxed level of economic regulation in Canada. The presence of smaller carriers forces the larger players to act in a more competitive manner. Whether these smaller carriers can remain economically viable is an open question, but it is important that government policy continues to make it possible for challengers to contest the market. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prentice. We'll begin our our line of questioning, with Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to take this opportunity, Chair, to move a time-sensitive motion before we continue with the line of questioning today on this very, very important issue. I've put the motion on notice as of Friday, May the 3rd, and this motion is as follows. Given that A, Sustainable Development Technologies Canada, a $1 billion taxpayer-funded company, is under investigation by the Auditor General and the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, a former director of the fund, Andre Lise Mithot, helped to send multiple companies in which she has a financial interest, millions of dollars, and despite this, the government appointed her as a director to the Canada Infrastructure Bank. The committee here testimony from the following witnesses for no less than 2 hours each: the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions, and Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc; the CEO of Canada Infrastructure Bank, Aaron Corey; officials from the Senior Personnel Secretariat in the Privy Council Office; founder and managing partner of Cycle Capital, Andre Lise Mithot. And Mr. Chair, I'm raising this motion today because, once again, the ability of this government to make ethical and sound decisions is in serious doubt. The Sustainable Development Technology Fund is embroiled in a scandal in which the fund is under investigation for funneling millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars to companies that its director had a financial interest in. One of the directors who is implicated in this is Miss Andre Lise Mithot, and her companies received $42 million from SDTC while she was on their board. This director is also involved in providing companies she's connected to with special COVID payments. Despite these serious conflicts of interest and ethical issues, Ms. Methot was recently appointed to Canada's Infrastructure Board. As the committee that is comprised with providing oversight of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, it is extremely important that we get to the bottom of this issue in which the director herself admitted that she had conflicts of interest. Canadians need to have trust in their federal and democratic institutions. And to this end, we need to hear from the minister who appointed her, who was Minister LeBlanc. We also need to hear from the officials in the Privy Council office, and we're proposing that we also hear directly from the CIB and Ms. Methot herself. I hope that this motion will receive the support from all parties around the table. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Mr. Badaway, I had you on the speaker's list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we have witnesses here today that I'm sure have traveled some distance to get here, and we have issues that we're dealing with respect to the study that we're entertaining. So I would ask Mr. Chair that we adjourn debate on this, put a motion forward to adjourn debate on this, and we can entertain this next meeting. And I would also advise that the clerk make the appropriate arrangements to deal with it next meeting, so that therefore we're not wasting anybody's time that may travel to be given testimony for the study that we're going to be moving forward with. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. That is a dilatory motion. Therefore, we'll go directly to a vote. And for that, I'll turn it over to our clerk.
Mr. Badaway? Yes. Mr. Iacono?
Yes.
Mr. Fillmore?
In favor.
Mr. Sheehan?
Yeah.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Straub?
No.
Mr. Muse?
No.
Dr. Lewis?
No.
Mr. Williams?
No.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval?
No.
Mr. Bachrach?
Yes.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
The motion carries. For that, Dr. Lewis, I'll turn the floor back over to you so you can proceed with your line of questioning to our witnesses.
I believe that I'm going to cede my time to my colleague, Ryan. Mr. Williams is going to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many minutes do I have left? How many minutes do I have left?
You have 5 minutes and 54 seconds.
Fantastic. Ms. Lawford and Mr. Coleman, thank you for coming to committee today. Nice to have you here. You did mention quite a few good ideas in your opening statement. I do want to start with the state of airline competition in Canada. We are here because Lynx Air has gone under, a competitor, an ultra low-cost carrier. We still have Flair, though, and Flair CEO was here. I'm not sure if you caught the testimony a couple weeks ago. He did mention some anti-competitive behavior that's very concerning happening in Canada that is threatening his business and that airline that is competing in some major routes. Can you comment on the state of anti-competitive behavior in Canada and how that's threatening airline competition, particularly for new entrants into the markets?
I'll start. We had thought that Flair had previously complained, and the Competition Bureau confirmed it today on route matching and price cutting. That's the usual method for an established incumbent to try to break a new player. The specific allegations were on routes, I believe, one from Edmonton, and that has been dropped. But our concerns with that type of behavior is that the Competition Bureau has reacted in a slow way. We're hopeful that the new changes to the Competition Act will allow either the Competition Bureau or a party to go directly to the tribunal with a more quick application in the nature of a prohibition, but we don't know if that's going to work yet. So one of the concerns that we have is airlines maybe don't do this themselves for other reasons, but there is anti-competitive behavior going on, so it's hopefully going to be one of the outcomes of the Competition Bureau that the Bureau will take that seriously and start doing that.
Part of the transport minister's role is to ensure there is healthy competition in Canada, especially in the airline sector. Has the government dropped the ball in terms of competition in Canada? Do we have competition in Canada?
I mean, from a consumer point of view, it's very discouraging. The mergers aspect, which has been spoken about, is very depressing because in the United States, mergers are blocked with fairly high regularity. There was just the Spirit Air merger in the United States that's run into trouble, and that's typical of their activity there. We just don't seem to have either the act or the will to carry that out, and then that helps. In terms of other changes, you know, we've heard a lot from Canadians that they don't have enough choice, especially in smaller communities, and I think that is due in part to competition lacking, yes.
In terms of mergers, are you aware that Canada has never blocked a merger?
Oh yes, we're well aware because we work in telecom.
And certainly, you know, the latest three that we mentioned earlier, in terms of First Air Canada North, Air Canada and Air Transit, which was approved, never went through because of COVID, but WestJet and Sunwing, how has that affected competition in airlines in Canada, those three mergers? Oh, sorry, the two, and then one that didn't, if it would have happened.
Just for the record, PIAC opposed both Sunwing and the Air Transat Air Canada merger. My understanding is that the European Union blocked the Air Canada Air Transat merger, and probably COVID didn't help the business environment. It is discouraging to see the Competition Bureau say this is anti-competitive, and then the minister say there are other considerations which are never really specified in enough detail to have a merger go through. So that dynamic we're trying to change with our recommendation to take it out of the hands of the Minister of Transport. In the United States, the Transport Minister doesn't approve mergers. It's done, you know, the Department of Justice does so.
We had some smaller airports come to the table. I think that's really important. Canada is very rural. We only have 94 urban centers, 3,700 rural municipalities in Canada. So we need our smaller airports to step up. Abbotsford is really neat because Abbotsford is within the vicinity of a Vancouver airport destination. We look at jurisdictions like Tokyo. They do shares where some airports will do regional, some will do long haul. There's different ideas that helps rural grow in order to provide the gates and perhaps the routes, which is really something we struggle with. How do we grow our rural airport system, and what do we do to create competition with that aspect while growing the competition in the urban airport centers?
I think for the ULCCs, they can be very helpful to open up routes to smaller airports, but they have to be supported in some fashion beyond just the competition protection. That's why we suggested a lending library of planes. It could be something else. And then regional powers like Porter and, well, I'm running out of examples, but WestJet could be asked to do more in their region, and an air policy from transport would help in that regard.
Thank you. Oh, I have 20 seconds. Fantastic. In terms of, we talked about also the gate allocation. Other jurisdictions seem to look at common use gates. That seems to be something that works very well in, I think, New York and other high frequency airports. You land in Pearson right now, and I call it Air Canada Alley. There's gates that are just dominated only by Air Canada. How do we produce more competition with the slot allocations for gates to ensure there's more competition for Porter, Flair, and other airlines that want to compete?
10 seconds, please, Mr. Lawford.
Yeah, the present rules are, I believe, that the incumbents get first shot back at it, and we want to maybe take a look at that. As I said, in our recommendations, putting some aside for new entrants so that they're there as a first stop, and then the incumbents get to get it if the ULCCs won't take them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawford, and thank you, Mr. Williams. Next up, we have Mr. Fillmore, and I'll take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Fillmore to our committee on behalf of all members. Mr. Fillmore, good to have you. The floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm glad to be back. I was an associate member some years ago and glad to be back with the committee again today. I'd like to begin by addressing my question. Well, first of all, thank you to the witnesses for sharing your time with us today and your knowledge. I'd like to begin with Dr. Prentice, if I could. Dr. Prentice, I'd love to ask you about the future of airships in Canada. Perhaps we can have you back another time to talk about that. I'm fascinated by your work there. But today I'll stick to the script of the study that we're interested in. Of course, everyone around the table knows that the transportation industry in Canada, the airline industry in Canada, is a critical component of the Canadian economy. But we seem to be in a cycle in Canada that kind of lacks true competition, with smaller airlines being bought out or failing. What are the key takeaways, would you say? What are the lessons to be learned from all of this? And if I could sort of ask you, as you think about it and respond to that, of course, we're looking for recommendations here. So sort of framing it with recommendations in mind would be helpful.
Well, thank you very much. You know, it's difficult because you have to ask the question of, well, what is the competition that's possible within a market? You know, again, we have a very narrow linear market for most of the air travel. Most of the air travels between the major centers, the 9 or 29 major airports. And you've got the same sort of service offered, except one has more frequency, and consumers are going to look for that because they want to get home at the time they want to get home. Some connect over to international services, and you have to also consider that international market has international carriers as well as our domestic carriers. So there's more competition in those international markets than just WestJet and Air Canada. Of course, they have a feeder system leading to those markets, and there's a question of how many foreign airlines fly into which markets. Right now, we're in a situation where there's a great shortage of pilots, and the actual amount of competition we have is constrained by that. So, to some degree, some of the services that might go to smaller communities is not happening because there's just nobody to fly the airplanes, and that's an issue in its own right. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question fully enough, but and certainly I would love to talk about airships. One of the issues that we're talking about here, and I speak to, is only airline competition in southern Canada. We start looking at the north, there really is no competition, and it's very hard to have competition because of the thinness of the markets and the cost of actually operating in those markets. So another form of transport to help assist in that would make a big difference.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know that some of your research is related to the movement of goods, not just people. Supply chains are on all of our minds these days. And I wonder if you have any reflections on the impact of the existing rules, especially those around competition, on the ability of our ability to move goods around the country on supply chain. Is there a link between supply chain challenges and competitiveness in the airline industry?
I don't really think so. I mean, first of all, you've got dedicated cargo movers like Cargojet, as well as the big airlines moving in belly space. Most of the air cargo is moved by the couriers, the UPS and FedEx, links into Purolator and of course Cargojet. So cargo moves pretty well. The big airlines are now into this. WestJet and Air Canada both have cargo services now. So they're operating that as well. I don't think there's anybody ever complaining that I hear about on air cargo.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Prentice. I'd like to move to our friends at PIAC. If I hope I'm pronouncing it. If there is an acronym, I'm pronouncing it correctly. You mentioned in your opening comments that there are barriers to entry for competitors, and you gave several, I think 5 or 6 recommendations to deal with those barriers, but I didn't hear a clear articulation of the barriers. And I wonder if you might sort of give us I think there's about a minute and a half left. If you could give us a rundown of what you see as the barriers.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to cheat a bit and use the competition bureaus from 2015 in a submission to the OECD. First one was the change of foreign ownership, which has been done. Second one, lack of feed traffic at both ends of the routes. Third one was effective frequent flyer program, which no one's spoken about so far. Lack of business class airport lounges, lack of established brand. Costs of leasing or purchasing aircraft, which is a huge one we did address. Costs of hiring flight crew. Obtaining access to airport facilities, especially gates, and lots of other hardware. Costs of committing to a schedule and establishing a reputation for reliability, well, advertising, travel agency, familiarization, blah, 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 regulatory requirements and under the Transportation Act, and scarcity of attractive time slots at key airports, and that one we tried to address as well. So that's the Competition Bureau's list. We say that, but I'd like to see what they would find if they did a new market study.
Okay. Mr. Chair, is there a moment left or are we at the end?
You have 30 seconds, sir.
Just quickly, what do you think accounts for the success and popularity and busyness of WestJet and Air Canada, given the reputational harm that's come about lately?
Lack of other choice. And to be honest, both have rationalized, if I can put it in a nice way, their operations to east and west of the country, which makes them more money and is more convenient for them, but may not be for Canadians. Again, no choice. So you've got basically duopoly market for many routes in Canada, and so we live with what we have.
Thank you very much,
Okay,
Mr.
thank you very
Philbin.
much to the witnesses.
And thank you, Mr. Lawford. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Next, we have Mr. Barcelou Duval for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. I was struggling to find the right microphone here. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here with us today. I appreciated the opening remarks, and I would like to hear some more, especially the 6 recommendations you made in the Public Interest Center. I hope we are unanimous on that in the committee. I would like to go a little bit more into some of the recommendations you mentioned. One specifically, you spoke about access to the gates and to slots for new arrivals in the market. Through what mechanisms could this be implemented? Maybe it was stated in your comments, but I didn't pick up on it. You said this could be obliged by the Competition Bureau, but maybe it could be automated in the airport processes. There's some mechanisms that might be more appropriate in accomplishing this. I'll start this in French and then switch to English. There is a pressure to the means in the airports and Transport Canada and the carriers.
How the rules, how the slots are allocated, I believe, is mostly right now a matter of negotiation between the airports and the airlines. And the minister with C-52 is only just going to get the power to ask what's going on. So involving transport more in that negotiation would probably assist. And then a rationalization of where competition law can say something about those arrangements is going to help. So I see the Competition Bureau taking baby steps towards inserting itself in the airline industry's regulation from a competition point of view, and hopefully it will eventually be 4 parties talking about such things as slots. But for the moment, it's really only 2, and because it's a dominant carrier and an established airline, as I said, they go on the use it or lose it rule. If Air Canada wants it back and they've been using it, they get it back.
Oui, parce que ça m'amène justement au point quand...
Yes, it brings me to the point that currently it's the airports that decide how, to whom is attributed the departures and the gates. But I understand the concept of first come, first serve. If you're there, you take up the space, it's yours. But the problem is if there is somebody occupying 70% of the space, and it's saying when a space gets freed up, I want it, and this is a major client, it's kind of hard to say no. And if you want to have a new entry, why not reserve 10% of the gates for the new entries each year? Great. Thanks for your answers. Fully appreciated. You also mentioned, it was mentioned by several speakers today, that almost all your merger proposals were approved by the government. What you're proposing is that right now the mergers should be assessed independently from the government. The Competition Bureau, the final decision will be taken. There will be no recourse. So are there any possible remedies in some certain extraordinary circumstances, we can always go before the Federal Appeals Court for relief from the tribunal all the way up to the federal court. So that would be in place for those that might disagree with the decision. But it's really to take away the department's power. The minister's powers don't seem to have served the Canadians that well. Not yet. They don't seem to really even want to use or exercise these powers. How much time do I have, Mr. President? Minute 40? Good. So maybe I'll turn to the other witness, Mr. Prentice. Quickly, during the last meeting of this committee, I don't know if you were listening to the deliberations, but Gabriel Lukacs from Air Passengers Right came and said it might be interesting to have a data collection system that is more detailed, comparable to what is done in the U.S., just to allow us to have better information to better enlighten legislators. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's a good idea?
So I can't answer your question.
À ce moment-là, peut-être je vais la poser à M. Lawford.
So maybe I should ask Mr. Lawford, Mr. Basafo Local, I will check if the interpretation is working or if it's because there is a delay.
Mr. Prentice, are you able to hear me when I'm speaking in French with the translation?
I can hear you now in English, but not in French. No.
Donc, si je vous parle en français, il n'y a pas de traduction.
So when I speak in French, you can't get the translation.
All right, we're going to stop the clock, Dr. Prentice. We're just going to make sure that we can get a translation for Mr. Barcelou Duval.
Peut-être qu'il n'a pas pesé sur son bouton.
So what I'm going to do, actually, I just spoke with the clerk. We're going to suspend for 2 minutes to rectify the situation, and then we'll come right back. So the meeting is suspended. Back to order. According to the clerk, we have rectified the audio-visual translation issues, so we'll continue with our line of questioning. Et c'est pour ça, je vous passe la parole.
And that's why, once again, Mr. Barcelou Duval, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds left. So thank you, Chair. My question to Mr. Prentice was, during our last committee meeting, we had an opportunity to receive Gabriel Lukacs from Passengers Right. I don't know if Mr. Prentice listened to that session, but one of his recommendations was to put in place a data collection system at the federal government level on what's happening in the airline industry that's more detailed, similar to what happens in the United States, and that could maybe enlighten decision makers on the state of competition. Do you think these types of data could be useful for everyone involved?
I'm always in favor of more information. I think it helps consumers make more decisions. The only thing that sometimes holds it up is the issue of whether it is divulging competitive issues between the airlines themselves. But I don't see how that would be a problem here.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Parfait.
Great.
Nous avons
So next we have Mr. Bachrach.
6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lawford, good to have you back. And thank you to our other witness as well, Dr. Prentice. My first question, and my colleague Mr. Badaway touched on this, we've heard the recommendation that Canada allow the entry of foreign airlines in order to provide more competition in the air sector. And I'm just curious about unintended consequences of that. Like, I'm assuming that there are much larger American airlines out there that would have some advantage. How do we avoid a situation where we look 10 years down the road and the entire air sector in Canada is dominated by foreign carriers that have the base of operations outside the country?
Thanks for the question. I mean, that's obviously our concern as well. Canadians, I think, along with successive governments, have all wanted to have the sovereignty and the control of the domestic airline industry with Canadian players, allowing limited landing rights for international flights from international carriers, obviously, but no cabotage, as was spoken to, and foreign ownership limits in order to have control by Canadians so that they listen to the regulator or regulators. We tend to agree with that, and it has to be studied very carefully. And obviously, larger routes, if we did go with cabotage or more foreign entry, would be used, and smaller routes would likely be ignored, leaving us to a situation where would the government, for example, have to subsidize all travel in the north or from the south to the north, which I don't think Canadians would agree with, but it should be studied in detail if we were going to go down that route.
Mr. Lawford, you heard the testimony earlier about the north and rural regions and the cost of air travel. I'm just wondering what your views are on how we provide critical transportation service for communities where the size of the market doesn't really allow for competition.
Well, we're back to the perpetual question of whether there are certain routes which have to be subsidized because you're going to have one player who will then charge monopoly prices, or whether that should be regulated in the sense that that's the only carrier allowed in there, and then the prices are regulated in return. That's going back to the 1980s. That's one way. Otherwise, a subsidy to customers or to airports or to airlines. And you can, I believe one of the previous witnesses said, try to tender a reverse auction to get the lowest price. These are all ideas. I agree, though, that the present cost and convenience and service in the north and to some rural and remote parts of Canada is somewhat shameful and very holding back industry and people's social and economic life. So we need to do more of that because there are not a lot of other choices like rail or driving 16 hours to get to where you need to go.
We've heard from the airports that they would like to see government move away from the user pay model and invest in the air sector and invest in air sector infrastructure as a public good. And I've raised, questions about investment in the air sector versus other transportation sectors. We've lost bus service in our country. Our passenger rail system is really not only a shadow of its former self, but doesn't stack up to what other countries are offering. But I'm just curious if moving away from the user pay model and investing more public money in, for instance, airports, can deliver competition and lower prices for consumers. Do we see any evidence of that?
Some interesting developments on airports. Australia has a private model, private financing. It's something that should be looked at. 35 years ago, we said that airports should be privatized, believe it or not. It could be done with public money as well. The present sort of PPP structures for larger airports have their problems and don't seem to be keeping up with the infrastructure needed and the building that's needed for the increase in air travel that we need in Canada. As for other supports, I think sneaking in some direct taxpayer support of the airline industry is appropriate. It does benefit all Canadians, whether you don't travel on the plane or not. Doesn't matter. Your doctor probably comes there, and your food probably comes in. All sorts of other benefits economically to having air connection across the country.
Yeah, I think that's very clear, especially given communities that rely heavily on air transport. Air travel is also a very difficult sector to decarbonize. There have been all sorts of claims made about sustainable aviation fuel, but I think there remains a huge gap between what is required in terms of production and supply and what is available on the market today. And at the same time, more and more people are flying. How do we allocate effort across the transportation sector to ensure that not only do people have affordable transportation options, but we're also meeting emissions reduction targets and decarbonizing transportation?
I note that in Australia, they're doing a couple of studies, and one of the large pillars of that is how to meet the other goals in an environmentally responsible fashion. So our recommendations that transport should go back and do an air policy for Canada would be an opportunity to make sure that's in there. At the moment, that's not really consideration and not in competition law, so that's another place to maybe try to center that a bit more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. And on behalf of all members, I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today and contributing their testimony. With that, this meeting is adjourned.